As you know, we're celebrating the 4th of July, the day that commemorates the birth of our nation, the United States of America. America has been referred to as the Great Experiment, in part because it's grounded in the very high ideal of individual freedom. It's been said that freedom is not free, which means we have to take the necessary measures to keep our country safe from those who would seek to undermine or destroy the ideals upon which this nation is founded. We appreciate all the men and women involved in helping to maintain this environment that gives every individual the freedom to engage in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in ways that are actually unique to each one of us. What this experiment demonstrates is that there is a lot more to the actual experience of freedom than that of enjoying the privilege of a free nation. The element of consciousness plays a major role in how free an individual is. We've demonstrated that living in a free country doesn't guarantee that we as individuals will actually experience freedom. We know there are many ways we can become enslaved. Think of lack and poverty, for example, ill health, unsatisfying relationships. Maybe you're in a job you don't like. You feel enslaved to that job. Or maybe you're enslaved to some sort of addiction. There are many ways we can become enslaved and controlled by external conditions, which are really inner conditions. So we can physically live in the environment of a free nation. We can live in the land of the free and still be enslaved by spiritually immobilizing conditions. This is the issue we're going to look at over the next 2 weeks. Spiritual freedom. What is it? How do we think of it? And most importantly, how do we achieve it? There are some basic spiritual principles, some attitudes we can become aware of and put into practice that will allow us to experience the kind of freedom we long for. There are also plenty of misconceptions that our culture has accepted as being true. When we look at these from the spiritual perspective, we find that they actually perpetuate the bondage from which we're trying to escape. The first misconception we need to look at is the belief that our freedom depends on getting conditions right. Most of us operate under the belief that if we just get all of our conditions right, if we get everything in order, then we'll experience that freedom that has so far proven to be elusive. The first thing we want to consider is the difference between conditional freedom, freedom that depends on our getting conditions right, and freedom in the internal sense, which is really what we're after. We need to remember that conditions are dynamic. They change all the time. We might be looking for that day when we finally get everything just like we want it, where the unexpected becomes a thing of the past. And if the unexpected does happen, we want the assurance that the resources we need to handle it will be there, that there will never be another cause for anxiety. Now that's freedom. The problem is, that's never going to happen. Whenever we solve a particular problem, say we find that soulmate, we win the lottery, we experience a major healing, or we resolve all the issues around just basic survival. Does this mean that we'll never have another challenge? We'll never have another experience that demands more time, more money, more patience than we have right now? Because life is dynamic, because change is the one thing we can always count on, our conditions, rock solid as they may be today, are also going to change. If we make our internal freedom dependent on conditions, then the day will come when this freedom, this conditional freedom, will be challenged. And I'm not being pessimistic here. True freedom is attainable, but we can't achieve it through a materialistic approach. We have to take a spiritual approach, because spirit is already free. We want to explore the principles of this freedom so we can know how to best align our consciousness with that free movement of life that we intuitively know can be ours. It's interesting that Jesus tied the condition of freedom to sin. He said, "You will know the truth, and the truth will make you free." He said this to people who were faithful followers, people who believed what he'd been teaching. When he made this statement, it really got their attention, and I don't think that was in a positive way. You will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. They couldn't figure out what he was talking about. One of them spoke up and said, "We're the descendants of Abraham. We've never been in bondage to any man. What do you mean the truth will make us free?" This is when Jesus brought up the issue of sin. He said, if you sin, you're a slave to sin. So he was implying that they were all a bunch of sinners. I can imagine that went over like a lead balloon. I'm sure they were all offended. Who wants to be called a sinner? Who wants to hear that our problems are directly tied to our sinful nature? Our problems are the fruit of sins we've committed. I'm sure that most of us have been exposed to teachings that harped on the consequences of sin. Maybe we think we've heard enough about it. I ran across a definition of sin that I think you're going to find interesting, and believe it or not, very helpful. Throughout my ministerial career, I have taught, as I learned, that the word sin comes from the Old English word sin, S-Y-N, which means to fall short or to miss the mark. It's a term associated with the discipline of archery. You can imagine an archer aiming his or her arrow at a target. They let the arrow fly, but they miss the intended bullseye. They fall short. They miss the mark. Bringing this idea into a religious context, it's pretty easy to compare it to a moral falling short, missing the mark of an ethical or moral standard. In the view of a number of mainline religions, this act of missing the mark, of falling short, has very serious consequences. It can profoundly impact, in a negative way, the future of the sinner for eternity. Things can get pretty hot for a very long time. Harping on the deadly consequences of sin has more or less been an effective way of keeping people on the straight and narrow. at least straight-laced and narrow-minded, as someone pointed out. The mark, the bullseye, is the standard that defines the high moral ground that we're told leads us to the kingdom of heaven. No one wants to miss this mark, but we all do, and more often than we might care to admit. The very thought that we're missing this mark, falling short of this high moral standard each time we have a negative judgmental thought, or we express anger or even fear, it compounds the problem. We not only miss the mark with the original offense, whatever that may have been, but we also add guilt to the mix, which only compounds the problem. As I was doing my research for this presentation, I ran across a definition for sin that I'd never seen. Sin, as derived from its Hebrew root, means to miss, but not in the sense of falling short or missing the mark. In this context, to miss means to be absent. I missed my dental appointment. I missed the phone call. I missed the weather report. In other words, I wasn't there. I was absent. So to miss in this sense means not being present. And what does this mean? It means that we're engaging in life only from the surface level of our being. That which we are at the deepest level is not present. Now, the soul is always present, but we're interacting with life as if our soul is absent, as if it's missing in action. And how can this be? How can we be here and missing at the same time? By the time you see this presentation, Beth and I will have made another pilgrimage across the great state of Kansas. Those of you that have made this drive know that it's flat and it goes on for many miles. It's a little like Red Skelton said of Texas. It's miles and miles of miles and miles. And they're beautiful miles, don't get me wrong. But it's easy to get lost in your own thoughts as you're driving along. As the miles roll by, you can slip into a kind of autopilot. You're there driving your car, but you're not really there. You're wondering if you unplug the iron or remember to cancel your mail. You can be thinking of any number of things that have nothing to do with what's actually happening in your life at the time. So according to this definition, this is what we mean by sin. We're doing something, but we're not present while we're doing it. What's another example of doing something while we're not present? I think one of the most common things we do is engage in that great freedom-robbing pastime we know as worry. To worry is to be in one place physically, while mentally and emotionally engaging in something else entirely. You're in your life. Your friends and family can look at you and say, there you are. But the truth is, when we're worried about something, we're not really present. In fact, we can be so worried that we don't even know there's anyone else around. They see us, but we don't see them. We're someplace else. We're focused on what might happen, what should have happened, or what happened that shouldn't have happened. In other words, we're not present in the what is. We're completely absorbed in the what if. We're absent. We're absent from this now moment. What I have often said about worry is that we only worry about things we can do nothing about. We only worry about things we can do nothing about. If we could do something about them, we'd stop worrying. And why can't we do something about them? Because we worry about things that are not present. They're not here now. In a way, we can actually deal with them. So this means that while we worry about these things, we're not present. We're here, but we're not here. We're missing from the present. The present shows up, but it can't find us. Where is he? Where did she go? He's in the future trying to work out some problem. Or she's in the past busy blaming her parents for all the problems she has today. You see how this can tie into the idea of sin. We're not present. We're missing from the only place where our life is happening, the here and now. When I was 9 years old, my family moved to the little town of Gower, Missouri. We moved from St. Joseph, Missouri, which at that time had a population of around 70,000. Not that big of a town, but Gower had a grand total of 500 people, small by every standard. I was in the 4th grade. The teacher I inherited was a woman that I just didn't like, and she didn't like me. In her mind, I was the city slicker who didn't know much about the earthier values of rural life. Of course, she couldn't have known that I really did prefer the country to the city. The highlight of my life at that time was to stay for a few days on my grandparents' farm, 250 acres, in Missouri. For whatever reason, we didn't hit it off. She seemed to do her best to make my 9-year-old life as miserable as possible. I'm sure that I could find justification for going back into the past and blaming her for many of my adulthood insecurities. But I guess that would fall into the category of sin as we're thinking about it here. Though this was a pretty traumatic period for me, I did manage to finish that school year and reach the promised land of summer. I made it to freedom. I was totally relieved, totally free. I didn't have to get up each morning and confront the fears and anxieties or deal with the problems of getting along in a relationship with a mutually sworn enemy. About midsummer, and I don't remember the date, but I do remember the exact moment, I started thinking about the end of summer and that dreaded beginning of a new school year. My fear was that the 5th grade would be equally as bad as the 4th, and I wasn't looking forward to that at all. I also knew the summer was slipping by way too fast. School was going to start again, and the beginning of a school year meant the end of my freedom. That thought invoked a very heavy feeling, very uncomfortable. I did not want to go back to school. I remember coming to the realization that if I could just hang on to this now moment, if I could somehow savor every second of those long summer days, really take in the smell of the newly mown hay, fully appreciate the blueness of the sky from the vantage point of a wide open pasture, if I could fully absorb those billowing thunderheads that meandered over the countryside, if I could really hear the summer song of the birds, the buzzing of the bees, and be fully present on the fishing trips and all those many things that a 10-year-old boy loves to do with his freedom. The summer and my freedom could last an eternity. If I could just hang on to the now moment, I could maximize the glory of my summer freedom. So I began to affirm one word, and that one word was now. Every time my thoughts started to drift to the future, I'd bring them back into the moment by speaking the word now. And when I spoke this word, I would become conscious of my surroundings. I would fully engage in whatever experience I was having at that moment, that long summer day. But there's a problem. Jesus said, whoever sins is a slave to sin. What I was doing was right in principle. I was doing my best to bring my attention to the now moment. The problem, the sin I was committing, is found in the why, the motivation behind my doing this. Was I truly seeking to live in the now moment, or was I trying to avoid a future by running from something I feared? And of course the answer is that I was attempting to run away from something I feared. I was attempting to build a kind of firewall around myself, a firewall called this now moment. And I hoped this now moment would never end. And of course this hope is justified because the now moment never ends. But what we do in the now moment has a beginning and it has an end, especially if what we're doing is conditional. I'm going to wrap myself in the cocoon of this now moment so I can insulate myself from an undesirable future. This is what it means to be a slave to sin. I think about a thing I don't want to experience. It bothers me. So I try to surround myself with some level of protection, something that will provide a buffer against that fear. Well, what if it were possible for me to come to the end of my summer and actually get excited about going back to school? It would take on a whole new meaning, bring my awareness into the now moment, and actually take my life one day at a time, one moment at a time. I would allow myself to experience my life in an actual state of freedom. I would live without the fear of the impending change. I move from the what if syndrome to the experience of what is. What is that my life is happening now, at this moment, unhindered by all the thinking around what if. My soul is absolutely free. When I was seeking freedom from the 5th grade, I was thinking in terms of time and space. I'm here now, but the time will come when I'll have to face this thing I'm not looking forward to. So I'll do something now that will protect me from this thing I fear. The soul is always in the present moment. It can't leave. It doesn't need to. There's nothing in the future or the past that our soul needs. The self-image, on the other hand, can never permanently enter the present moment. This may run contrary to much of what you've learned about the now. A great deal has been written about the power of now, how important it is for us to be here in this moment. We respond to the concept in a good and positive way. It makes perfect sense to us. But when we actually try to live in the now moment, we're trying to force the self-image into an environment that it's not designed to inhabit. It's like trying to make an air-breathing mammal live underwater, or a fish live on land. The self-image is completely grounded and constructed around the body-oriented concepts of time and space. The soul, on the other hand, fully inhabits this moment, this eternal now. We don't have to urge our soul to come to the now. It never leaves. But again, if we're trying to live in this now moment, we're attempting to force our self-image into a foreign environment. And I'm sure that everyone watching this video has tried that. You've discovered that it's not only difficult, it's impossible to maintain. You can't force your attention to stay in the now moment. The senses are too easily distracted. The soul has never struggled with this problem. The reason that we struggle with it is because we're not present. We're driving across Kansas, engaged in an emotional battle we're still having in Colorado. Because we're not present, because we're missing, we can't experience the soul. How can we tell this is true? We can always tell because it feels like something vital to our freedom is missing. You can accomplish things and experience the reward of that feeling of meaningful achievement. But your successes are dogged by the feeling that it's not enough, that something is still missing. And what that something is you. It's me. It's our true essence, our soul. But remember, the soul is not actually missing. The soul can't go anywhere, but our attention certainly can. We can still be in Colorado while we're driving across Kansas. Our attention isn't focused on the soul. We're not experiencing our life from this broader spiritual context that is the source of freedom, the freedom that we seek. We're engaged with the apparatus of the self-image, its fears and rejections, its failures, its regrets of the past and fears of an uncertain future. All those many things the self-image considers a normal part of life. Resolving these kinds of issues even becomes the focus of our spiritual studies. But it's important to understand that we don't resolve these issues at the level of the self-image. We can't. It's simply not possible. We must first stop sinning. You've been told that, I'm sure. But in the context of sin, as we're thinking about it here, we're to become aware of our spiritual essence, our soul, right now. We're not dwelling on what if. We're bringing our awareness to what is. As I've already said, the soul forever inhabits this eternal now. The self-image is always darting into the future and the past, Occasionally it dips its toe into the present. In other words, the self-image lives a life of not being present. Remember the consequences. You're not going to be spanked by God. You're not going to be condemned to hell. You're simply going to live a life that feels like something's missing. That missing something keeps pushing, keeps driving us forward, keeps making us want to achieve something more, something that will finally provide that missing element. But the time comes when we stop and really engage in some serious soul searching. We say, I'm tired of being a slave to sin. I don't want to be a slave to the feeling that something in me is missing. I want to be the son. I want to live fully in this house that is my life. In the second part of this series, we'll explore a few more ideas on what it means to be consciously absent from your life. And more importantly, we'll look at some ways where we can reverse this attention trend. It's not about trying to force our attention into this now moment. It's more about the practice of consciously bringing our soul into the mix of our daily life. I want to thank you for coming out, and I hope you found this format helpful and inspirational. I also hope you'll join me for part 2 of The Truth Will Make You Free, Coming Home.